Hello, BookTube. I've said many times on this channel that in my capacity as an online and in-print book section editor, I am always available to help people break into the world of formal book reviewing. That's absolutely true. It's one of my favorite things to do. It always has been. And over the years of doing that, I've had a number of people contact me not only expressing their willingness to give that a try, but also asking what that means. You keep saying that if you want to break into formal book reviewing, let us know. And I think I would like to do that, but I'm not 100% sure what a formal book review is, what you mean by that. And I've made videos on this subject, but I thought we'd go over some key points again in this video, especially since I realize that it can be a nebulous subject, or at least seem that way, for decades before there was a YouTube, before there was a BookTube, before there was an internet. I had critical colleagues of mine who would often windify on paid program panels or whatnot about whether or not we can even define what a book review is, man. How do we even know what it is? John Leonard, you are missed, but I don't have many hairs to pull out anymore when I read your stuff. I've had critical colleagues of mine, including published book reviewers who published everywhere, often say that who knows what a book review really is? Who can really define it? In this case, as in all cases, forever, I have routinely told people, when you ask the question, who can even define it, the answer is me. I can, of course, define this thing that you are claiming has no definition, cannot be defined. A book review is an artful assessment of a book's strengths and weaknesses. Did we get that? It's fairly simple. Nothing complex or Hegelian about it. It's an artful assessment of a book's strengths and weaknesses. If it's not artful, then it's a book report. Just weighing the stuff that's on the page. And if it's not an assessment, it's just a reaction. Now, I want to stress here at the beginning of this video, which I will try not to have go on for an hour, although I could talk for 4 hours on this very subject. I want to stress right away that there is value to be found in book reports, and there is definitely value to be found in reactions. Most of what is referred to as book reviewing in the current moment, I'm making this video in 2024, is in fact book reactions. And I mean the huge percentage of it, 95% of what we consider to be book reviewing out in the world, is actually just book reactions. The endless writing about books on sites like Goodreads or Amazon are almost all book reactions and not actual book reviews. And also a large percentage, I would argue a gigantic percentage, 95, 97, 98% of the bookish related content on BookTube. To say nothing of Book Talk, we won't mention Book Talk, on BookTube is book reactions rather than book reviews. There are a number of fairly big book-related channels on BookTube whose hosts refer to themselves as book critics when they are nothing of the sort. They aren't never written a book review or spoken a book review in their lives, wouldn't have the first idea how to do it. And again, I want to stress, book reactions are lots of fun and can often be very illuminating, but they aren't the kind of thing I'm talking about. They aren't the kind of writing that has 2 or 3 centuries of history behind it. So I thought we'd go over some of the distinguishing characteristics, some of the basics of what is actually a formal book review. The number one first thing being you have to contextualize the book for the reader. You have to tell them what the book is and who the author is. You must not under any circumstances assume that they know those things. Instead, you must tell them. We are not talking about later steps in this list of basics. Here, we're just talking about contextualizing. What is it that you're actually talking about? You must devote space to that in a formal book review in order to bring the reader up to speed on the basics of what you're about to talk about. And while you're doing that in the whole course of this thing, in the whole course of a formal book review, of course, you personally have no place in the review. Your authorial I, has no place in the review. In a review, not at all. In reactions, of course, that's the bread and butter of a book reaction, and I'm sure that you've all seen examples of that on sites like Goodreads or Amazon, where someone will start what they are calling a review of the book with, never really liked epic fantasy. Don't really have time to explain why. Long story. Might get to it someday. To which I always want to say, nobody cares. Nobody cares. You are assuming that you are the spotlight of this thing. And for a reaction, maybe you are. But for a book review, not at all. Not at all. Your book review, your formal book review must achieve the balance between being impersonal but not depersonalized. Of course, you are going to be present in your review. Of course you are. It will come through in your tone, in your prose, in the nature of your observations, but not in what you did last Sunday. The minute you do that, you increase the reader's awareness, you increase the reader's doubt that maybe, well, who knows if this isn't just an undigested bit of bacon that's causing you to rake this book over the coals, or who knows if this isn't a particularly tasty Cobb salad that's causing you to praise something that's actually a piece of crap. And it's not just the reader perception, it's also your own perception. When you're done reacting to a book and thinking about it at all, then you should take that big remove to make a bigger, wider profile review that isn't just you, that isn't just vented from your spleen. So I would say that that's the next major point here, is that you should abstract yourself from the review. But another major point here that I want to mention, it's a little bit pitiless now, just as it ever is, but although you are taking your personal eye out of a book review, you will still be there, and your experience will definitely still be there. It will show in your review. Not just your experience with writing reviews and getting across information to a readership, but also your, in the cases where it applies, your knowledge of the subject or of the author. The more knowledge of the subject and the author that you have, generally speaking, the more authoritative your review will feel, and that will just be obvious. And there is no way to simulate that. There's no way to Twitter mob that into existence. There's no way to browbeat that into existence. That comes just from experience. And that experience will inform your review of the book. But the next point flows from that, which is that no matter how much experience you have on the subject, you should not pontificate. You should not commandeer the review for your own purposes. We'll come back to this in another point, but you should not commandeer the review for your own purposes. You must remember, even when you have removed your authorial eyes from the piece, you must remember the reader is not here for you. Not in that sense, not in that direct sense. Readers will understand, they will come to know which reviewers they like more. But it will never be because they're learning in piecemeal your autobiography. It will be because of what your authority, what your experience is bringing to the subject. So you don't want the pontificating to shift the focus. A little bit of opinionizing in a review, of course, is not only good but necessary. But you don't want it to be so great that it shifts the focus back onto you, or draws the reader's attention to the fact that you are mostly venting rather than assessing. Because keep in mind, what we're talking about here is an artful assessment of a book's strengths and weaknesses. So once we get that done, once we get that settled, that you are removing your personal self from the review, but your identity, the experience and authority that you bring to the subject will very much be present in the review, then we want to get back to the basics. I opened with saying that you want to contextualize the book. What is this that I'm reviewing? Do not assume that your reader knows what it is. Instead, tell them what it is. The same thing linked to that is the next basic, which is to summarize the book. And here you might think that I'm verging into book report territory, but no, the artful part is going to save us in all cases when we come close to those rocks. But you, in addition to contextualizing the book, you must also summarize the book, and those two things are not the same. Contextualizing a book is, what is this? It's new. It's the author's first book. It's the author's 100th book. The author just died. The author just got a fatal diagnosis. The author just got a major award. The author was just knifed in the face. This is the first book on this subject that's ever been written. This, etc., etc., etc. This author invented this subject. That's the contextualizing part, where you bring the reader up to speed on what it is you're talking about. That's not the same thing as this next step, which is to summarize the book. In addition to bringing the reader up to speed on what the book is, you must bring them up to speed on what it says, because they don't know. Again, you must assume they don't know anything at all about the subject that you're talking about. Nothing at all. Because otherwise, if you don't assume that, if you assume a certain level of information on the part of the reader, you are, to use a noxious 21st century word, gatekeeping. And you don't want to do that. You want your piece of writing to be accessible to everyone. So your summary should be pithy, remember the artful part, and extremely economical as it can possibly be. In this list of basics for book reviewing, I don't want to wander into some of the specifics that I got into in earlier videos. In earlier videos, I was concentrating on formal book reviews as the fodder for the professional world. So I was talking about things like editors and word counts and deadlines. I'm going to try not to talk about that this time. This is just talking about the form itself. The form itself that I had been told a million times. Who can really define it, man? So we're not talking about any of those things, but when it comes to making a point about summarizing the book, I almost want to bring in word count. Even though we're not talking about that, I almost want you to urge you, in order to get better at summarizing, I almost want to urge you to pretend that you do have a word count. Let's say 800 words, of which no more than 300 can be summary of what's going on. No more than that. Any vigilant editor would cut you off long before 300 words of summary, because you should be able to do that. Books are not that hard. So you should be able to do all the summary that you need to do. Of course, if it's a novel, you're not going to want to summarize anything beyond 100 or 150 pages. You can allude to it, but you can't summarize it, or you'll be spoiling the ending of the book for the reader. And not just the ending, but the building dramatic tension. You don't want to take the air out of those tires any more than you absolutely have to. You can make informed allusions to those later things, but you can't talk about them in detail. And generally speaking, the equivalent applies to nonfiction as well. So your summarizing should be pithy. And one way to guarantee that you will learn how to summarize pithily is if you have a word count. So pretend that you do. Pretend that you have 500 words to write a review of this 800-page book that you just read. You don't, of course. In a theoretical exercise, you could write about it forever. You could write 800 pages of review of an 800-page book. But say you only have 500 words, and you want to do the book justice, and you want to leave plenty of room for your own assessment of the book. Well, then, what would you be? What would that be? What would out of 500, you could do maybe 175 words of summary. What would they be that would do the book justice? Believe it or not, it can be done, and you'll get better at it as you go along. One of the things that will eat up that space is our next major point, which is that you absolutely should quote from the book, no matter how short the review is, even if it's 300 words. To take an instance from my own working morning, no matter how short the review is, you should quote from the book. And you should make sure not to play dirty pool with your quotes. You shouldn't be hunting out the dumbest example from the book in order to support your contention that it is a dumb book throughout, especially if it's not. Because sooner or later, some of your readers are going to test you, as they should. Some of your readers are going to hear you say in a review, well, book X is dumb, and here's a quote to prove it. And they're going to think, okay, all right, but I'm still interested in the subject, or I still like the author. I like the reviewer. I usually trust the reviewer, but I'm going to get the book anyway out of the library. I'm going to read it. And you read it and suddenly that person realizes that's the only dumb sentence in the book. They're never going to trust you again. You're going to be off their list. They may even be vocal about it. Keep in mind, we're in a very vocal area of history. A person who's disappointed like that by the dirty pool of a reviewer can definitely make it known. You don't want to do it. It's bad practice. You want to quote from the book because it's fair. You're talking about the book. You should allow it to speak for itself, at least a little, right? And that brings us to the next point, which is that when you're done contextualizing the book, and when you're done abstracting yourself, so this is not a diary entry, you're not talking about your spleen, and when you are done summarizing the book, well, then it's time for you to do the reviewing part of the review. Then you need to review the book. Then you need to do the assessing part of the book's strengths and weaknesses. What parts does the author do well? What parts does the author do poorly? Do the poor parts outweigh the well-done parts? And in what way? Are there any insidious things that the author does? Any dirty pool that the author himself plays? This is where you do your assessment. And the key to your assessment is to do it. And that is rare. You would think that would be self-evident. But in the 21st century, we are all so used to muddying our own phrases. because this could work for you, or that could work for you, or this could work for you. No. When it comes time for you to review the book, you have to put your money on the line. You have to make assessments, and they have to be fairly sharp. No one's here to hear. No one's reading your review to hear you waffle about. You have to say what it is you think about the book, what conclusions you have drawn from it, what judgments you are making about it. It's thrilling. It's the most thrilling part of the review once you get the skills of the compressing and contextualizing out of the way. But it is also the scariest part, because it's right there and you can't change it. Once it goes out into the world, it's out into the world. And if you're wrong, well, you'll be wrong, and it'll be fairly obvious. So that's the leap into the dark, is that you have to make your assessments. And when you're making your assessments, you should try to restrain cant or ranting. Your assessments are meant to convey to the reader, who is your ultimate responsibility here, whether or not the book is worth their time, their attention, and their money. And I know it's satisfying to rant in a review. I know this. I've done it. I know it's satisfying to give vent to all sorts of cant. But the more of it you do, the more you erode the trust of the reader in what you're writing. You might think not. You might think that it shows passion. And it does. A little of it does. There's no harm at all in writing an angry review. A review in which the reader knows perfectly well that you are angry with the book. You don't just dislike it. You're angry with it. There's nothing wrong with writing that kind of a review. But if you don't control it, if you let it canter off into the fields, paragraph after paragraph, if you eat up a lot of those 800 words with just ranting, I think that undercuts your reader's confidence. But I want to stress here for the next point that eventually, the previous point was you have to reach a point of judgment. At some point, you have to review the book. At some point, you have to differentiate what you're writing from an actual book report. And it will also, at this point, be different from a reaction, because you'll be basing it on things that the reader can go and find themselves. So the next thing is that when it gets to the point where you do your reviewing, like I said, you should not pull your punches. Many books, most books, I would say, are largely average. They'll do some things well and some things poorly. They don't do anything really well. They won't probably do anything really poorly. Those books still deserve reviews. You can still write a review, and the review can still be enjoyable. We'll get to that. But in a review like that, you probably won't have any punches to pull, right? You won't have any punches at all. You won't be punching. You'll just be assessing. It should still be fairly straightforward, but some books will warrant haymakers. And the key here for this point, as we get to the end of this list, is you must not be afraid to do that. You must not be. A polite review is untrustworthy. And an untrustworthy critic is a fan or a troll. But they lose the mantle of being a critic the minute you can't trust them. You must not be polite in your review, is what I'm trying to say. You can be fair. You can, I guess, numb up your prose a little, round off its corners to make it, presentable to all time zones. But it's a bad idea. First of all, it verges on making the book review boring, which is going to be our final point. It verges on making your piece boring, but also it makes it useless. A reader of an overly polite review is going to realize when you're pulling your punches. They're going to realize when you're using a bland euphemism instead of what you really think. And if too many of those things happen in one review, that reader is going to think, well, I don't think this reviewer is telling me. I don't think they're giving me a review. I don't think I'm getting their assessment. I think that they know what their assessment is, and maybe if I got them drunk in private, they would hear it. But I'm not going to get them drunk in private. I'm coming to the review for that. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here with don't pull punches is, well, first of all, it applies to venue. I should stress that, even though I'm trying not to bring in professional stuff here. I am assuming with these points that you are writing a book review on your own, a formal book review on your own. That can certainly happen more in the 21st century than in any other human century. It's rare for you to be able to do that if you're writing it in a formal professional setting, because you'll have editors. And editors often impede, they often soften. A lot of them, they're are worried about sharp elbows and non-pulled punches. So in a formal setting, you might not have the ability to do that. In my settings, where I am a book section editor, the reviewer always does. They have to back it up. It can't just be, a flying left hook out of nowhere with no Marcus of Queensberry rules. It has to be grounded in the piece, but if it is, you can be as savage as you want. Or praise as highly as you want. You don't have to pull your punches in the venues that I run. But that's not true for a lot of editors. We're trying to leave the professional world out of here and just disembody the text of a formal book review that you're writing on your own without any limitations. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that even though there are no limitations, you will still have readers. And they will know if you're being polite, if you're minding the feelings of an author, they will know that you're doing that. And after a while, too much of that will erode their trust in you. You should not be caring about the feelings of the author or the publisher or anybody else. The only person you're working for is your reader. You shouldn't be caring about the author, which is why I tend to discourage reviewers from knowing too many authors, because the reader doesn't know the author or care how, whether or not you're spoiling their breakfast. The reader is your number one concern. And along those lines, we get to our last point here, which is that when you're done with all of this, you have to make the piece engaging, the piece itself engaging. You absolutely cannot say in this final point, well, the book was boring. So, what do you expect? What are you saying when you say that? The book was boring, so my review can be boring? There is never any justification for bringing more boring prose into the world. The world is already choked to the eyeballs with boring prose. So, when you're done with all of that, those other elements, when you've pulled yourself out of the review, when you've pulled your personal eyes out of the review, when you've stopped reading it with your lymph nodes, when you've contextualized the book, what is this thing? And then summarized the book, what does it do? What does it say? And then you've reached your point of judgment. You've leapt off into the dark. All right, I've contextualized this book. I've summarized it for you. Now I'm going to get to cases. This stinks. This is quite good. This is kind of dumb. This is derivative. Even the real bare bone stuff, which is not only is this kind of dumb, but it's almost word for word this other book, which was the second point that I was making about expertise, about authority. The more you do this, the more you will build up authority. And that's damning. But you have to do it. You're not here to pull punches. You're not here to write a polite piece. But when you're done with all of that, you then have to shape the resulting piece of prose, no matter how long or short it is, into something that's engaging. Remember our definition that I was told, hey man, how can you even say? Our definition is an artful assessment of a book's strengths and weaknesses. If you leave out any part of that, if it's artful but it's not an assessment, it's just you gonzo journalising your way through reacting with your spleen to a book, then it's not a book review, not a formal book review. If it only talks about strengths and not weaknesses, it's not a formal book review. If it only talks about weaknesses and not strengths, it's not a formal book review. I might point out here that if you read a book and it has no strengths at all, maybe it's not worth a review. And if it's not artful, then it's not a formal book review. No matter how many boring book reviews you've read, I maintain, and I am right, I've done more of them than anybody, I maintain that it has to be an artful piece of writing. So when you're done with all the other components, you have to work over the piece so that it's entertaining to read. A boring book review is a bad book review in exactly the same way that a boring book is a bad book. So there you go. Some basics of what I mean by a formal book review. You can see right away from this list that it takes more work, and I would argue more alertness, to do one of these things than it does to write a reaction for Amazon or Goodreads, or a book report, which often turns up a lot on Amazon and Goodreads, where a person is simply recounting, here's this, here's that, here's this, here's that, here's this, here's that. I really don't have any place in this. And also judgments don't have any place in this. This is just what it is. If it's either one of those things, well, those things can be useful, but they aren't what I'm talking about when I talk about a formal book review. So those are some basics for you. I could go on forever on this subject, but I want to urge you, if you think you might want to try it, definitely do so. I'm offering a large helping hand, not only to go over your piece with you and point out what it does or doesn't do right or wrong, but also to run it for a reading audience. So there you go. That's a list of the basics of book reviewing, and I will curtail this here, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.